G'day and welcome to Indie Over 50. My name is John Huggart and this channel is dedicated to those of us over the age of 50 releasing new music on YouTube and Spotify. My guest today is Stuart Coupe. He's an esteemed Australian icon as a rock journalist, as a band manager, a band promoter, and now a very well-established and successful author. Learn about public relations for Indie Over 50, but also the cool stuff in music. Welcome, Stuart. Where in the world do we find you today?
I am, as I have been for the last 10 years, sitting in my living room in Petersham in the inner west of Sydney.
And the inner west of Sydney is really, really important because it's kind of like the cradle of creativity for Sydney-siders, certainly here in Australia. A lot of great music venues and artists in residence as well.
Yeah, well, I've lived in Sydney since the end of 1978. So I grew up in Launceston in Tasmania, went to university briefly in Adelaide, and then moved to Sydney. So except for 6 years living in Blackheath in the Blue Mountains, I've been a Sydney resident and usually pretty close to the city because I can't drive a car, and so I need to be near buses and trains.
One question I always ask for all of our Indie Over 50 audience as well is, what was the first thing you spent your money on in relation to music?
The very, very first thing I bought was a single. I had saved up what I think was $1.05, which back in the 1960s was what it cost to buy a 45, a single. And I bought Friday on My Mind by the Easy Beats, which I still have that copy. It, to this day, continues to thrill me. When my memoir came out a couple of years ago, it frequently was played during radio interviews. And every time I heard it again, and I've heard it, thousands of times, the hairs on my arm stood up. So definitely Friday on My Mind by the Easy Beats was the very first. I'd heard it on the radio in Launceston, and I had no understanding, John, of really, it's quite a political song. It's about working for the rich man, dreaming of the end of the working week, etc. I just thought it was a glorious pop song, and strangely enough, I'll start name dropping now. I was in Paris interviewing Bruce Springstein backstage after a show, and we were sitting there. It was about 3:30 in the morning, and I said, "Oh, is there any Australian song that you love?" And he didn't miss a beat. He said, "Friday on My Mind" by the Easy Beats, but he said, "I've always wanted to play it," but he said, "The guitar parts are too complicated for me." And I'm sitting there going, hang on, you are not only an astonishing songwriter, you were one of the greatest lead guitar players of your time. What are you talking about? Friday on My Mind cannot be that complicated. But it was Bruce Springsteen, so I didn't challenge him. And I came back to Australia and I said to a whole bunch of musician friends of mine, I said, "Look here, Friday on My Mind by the Easy Beats, it's not that complicated, is it?" And to a person, they said, "Stuart, once again, that shows that you know absolutely nothing about music." They said, "It's actually a really complex song to play." And I was impressed that the last time Bruce Springsteen came to Australia, which is, probably 7 years ago now, he began his Sydney performance with Friday on My Mind. So I realised that, like many, many things in life, John, practice can make semi-perfect, because he did a pretty good version of Friday on My Mind.
Well, Stuart, I'm thrilled to hear that. A, because of the story about Friday on My Mind, and B, because I was there. And I just remember at that concert hearing those first couple of notes, and I thought, oh my goodness, what a great tribute to his audience that he's come to do that.
Yeah,
So
but now you know the back end, that he had struggled with that song for 4 decades to get it right.
yeah.
So 1981 was when we talked about it, and whenever that show was the first time I was aware that he'd ever played it in public.
Oh,
So
it was a terrific moment. And look, the other question that I ask for our Indie Over 50 guests is many of us grown up in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So we've got lots of hero bands and artists from our youth. Who is your favourite artist from the 21st century?
Oh, look, I mean, I actually find that a very, very difficult question to answer. My reasons are that in the passageway of my home are about 15,000 CDs. In the room where I'm talking to you and in surrounds are about 10,000 vinyl records. I listen to and there's hard disks everywhere clogged with digital music. I listen obsessively, constantly. I'm fortunate in my life that I'm up at about 6 o'clock in the morning and I get, 14 to 16 hours pretty much every day listening to music. So when people say, what's your favorite? At the moment I'm obsessed by a Sydney guy called Don West, who I'd never heard of 4 days ago, but the 18-year-old who shares my world came back from the Spilt Milk Festival in Canberra where he'd seen Kendrick Lamar and Doce. And I said, who else did you like? And he said, Don West. And I assumed Don West came from America as well. And then I did some research and no, Don West comes from the northern beaches of Sydney. And he's an incredible new soul R&B singer. I bought his record. I love his record. He's currently my favourite artist. One thing I will say is that I'm a great lover of contemporary and new music, and nothing gets me, well, a few things will get me more annoyed, but certainly right up there is people saying, oh, there's no good music, after the 60s, or there's no good music after the 70s, or the 80s was, great, but nothing since then. It's all garbage. And I look at whoever says that and I go, no. What's happened is you chose to stop your listening in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and you've defined your golden years and your golden period of listening to music there. And, Nick Hornby, the great writer, said a couple of years ago, when the internet became so prevalent, he said, now is the greatest time in history to be a music fan because everything is available. And like anyone who says, oh, there's no good music anymore is not listening. I mean, I hear every second day, I hear something brand new, contemporary, very, very frequently from Australia, which knocks my socks off. And I go, wow. And I can argue, and I have been known to argue, that there is more good music coming out globally in 2024 or 25 than there was in the much mythologized mid-1960s for those people. It's daunting how much music there is around, John. When I revert to being a radio presenter, it's an unusual week for me where I don't get sent 200 or 300 new songs or albums, and that's every week.
It's extraordinary.
They say that I have major issues with the unmentionable streaming service, which I describe as the devil's streaming service. But people do say that every day between 40 and 60,000 new songs are uploaded to that platform. And I go, that's a crazy amount of music. And also the internet has made everything that we would ever want to hear available. Like if I want to hear punk rock recorded in Indonesia between 1976 and 1979, I can, and I own the triple album compilation of the aforementioned. So it's all there, and it's staggering. Also, as someone who grew up in the 1960s, born in the 50s, that so much incredible music was being made globally during that time that we just didn't have access to. Everything was very controlled by record labels. Radio formats played what they were meant to play, and we were blissfully, as Australians, unaware of the phenomenal amount of music that was being created. Not just in in England and America, but in Nigeria, in Indonesia, in Japan. Pick a country, and now it's at our fingertips if we want to go and look for it.
I agree. I think it's one of the things we challenge ourselves, that 40, 60, 100,000 songs going up every day. But in that period of time, those songs were being written but they were being written to a wine bar audience and presented to a wine bar audience, maybe at best on a local label or a local small run production. So that just the opportunity to be shared globally all at the same time wasn't there, but they are now. So as you say, it's a really interesting insight that never a better time to be a music fan.
No, and you don't know where those fans are. I mean, with one of my radio shows, my most dedicated listener, and I hear from him every couple of weeks, is in Bangkok. And he tunes in every week online
Mm.
to listen to my radio show. And so we kind of, without thinking, we assume that our audience is in the city where we're broadcasting from, and and I remember a few years back, I'm good friends with a guy called David Frick, who was a music journalist for Rolling Stone magazine, and every time I'm in New York, he give me piles and piles of CDs. And then a couple of weeks after a trip, I was back and I was doing a radio show. And then I get a message from him saying, great to hear that the CDs I gave you are coming to good use. So he was sitting in New York listening to me broadcasting in Sydney. So that's one of the glorious things about, the internet. There are a lot of problems with the internet. We all know that. But that ability, my favorite, or one of my favorite radio stations is WFMU, which is a free-form station that's been going for decades, comes out of Syracuse University outside of New York City. And, I can listen to it whenever I want to. I just click a button and there's whatever program's on.
It's extraordinary.
It's a very, very beautiful thing.
Stuart, you've shared, we've learnt already for the viewers or listeners of our podcast today, some of your steeped history, your reference to your introduction and having a chat to Bruce Springsteen. You've talked about the piles of CDs and the library of records. So let's just dig into this. Can you just give us a bit of an overview and an introduction to our listeners of your background, your journey through music?
Oh, look, how long have we got? But the quick version, quick-ish version, John, fell in love with music as a kid, listened to music on my parents' on a crystal radio attached to, and people of a certain vintage will know what a crystal radio is. And I had a very early on just a desire to share my passion about music with other people. And I don't have a musical bone in my body, so I don't play, and I've never played music, but I wanted to write about it. So I just started writing when I was still at school. A teacher encouraged me, and we started a school magazine, which was basically an excuse for me to have an outlet to write about music. Which I did, slavishly copying, plagiarising is the word we use these days, a guy from Melbourne called Rob Smythe, who was a really pivotal influence on me. He wrote for Nation Review and was incredible. That's for the long version. Went to university at Flinders Uni in Adelaide, became one of the editors of Empire Times, which is the university paper. I put the Sex Pistols on the front cover of an issue, etc., etc. Whilst there, started a fanzine. This was 1976, called Street Fever. That grew into a national music magazine that a group of us started called Roadrunner magazine. Meanwhile, I was freelancing tentatively. Oh, I should say that I paid my way through university by hiring my then much smaller record collection to the ABC. Because the ABC had started up ABC FM in Adelaide. They had a rock and roll program presented by my friend David Woodhall, whose house I was living in Adelaide. They didn't have a record a library. David and I went to them and said, well, this guy's got a record collection that is the music that we want to play on the show, and he lives a block and a half away, and he's happy to put his records in as the library, and you're going to pay him $50 a week, which in 1977 was a lot of money. Because when I came to Sydney, I was earning $90 a week working full-time. So anyhow, I was freelancing for RAM magazine, Rock Australia magazine in Sydney. One day, Anthony O'Grady called me up and said, dear boy, how would you like to work for a real music magazine? I said, well, literally 2 days later, I was in Sydney. I said, how do I get all my worldly possessions to Sydney? He said, leave it with me. he called up the Angels band road crew who were playing. The Angels were playing in Adelaide. I then flew back to Adelaide briefly. The road crew came round one morning, knocked on the door. What have you got? I loaded up my worldly possessions. They put them in the truck with the Angels PA and music equipment, and slowly continued on their tour, driving it to Sydney, where they delivered it all to me. I worked for RAM. Then I left RAM after about a year and a half. I wrote the music column for the Sun Herald for 10 years, when the Sun Herald was the biggest selling newspaper in Australia. A lot of listeners will know me because of Dolly magazine. I started writing for Dolly in about 1985 and did that for 4 or 5 years, where I became a mini sensation at Dolly. I mean, there are a generation of women who now, John, if I mention my name, I might be ringing up to get a novel that I need to review or something like that, and I'll mention my name. There is always an audible pause, and I know what's coming next, and they go, "Not the Stuart Coupe from Dolly magazine." And I go, "Yes, Stuart Coupe from Dolly magazine." All right.
And just to explain that Dolly was that teen.
It was the only magazine in Australia at that time for teenage Australian girls. There was nothing else until the Dolly reader then had to, at a certain age, had to make a decision whether she was a Cosmo reader or a
Cleo.
Clio or Cosmopolitan reader. So I did that. Look, I freelanced for everybody that I could, try to make eke out a living. But I also one day, a guy from this band called the Hoodoo Gurus knocked on my door. Oh, I'd started a record label too. Sorry, Green Records. I told you I'd go on forever. And he knocked on the door. I was living in Cathedral Street in Woolloomooloo with my friend Roger Grierson. We had a record label called Green Records. We had a sort of glassed front where people could see us working. The guy from the Hoodoo Gurus knocked on the door. He said, "Stuart, everyone in the Hoodoo Gurus has had their phone disconnected because they haven't paid their bills. Can we give you $15 a week to be a phone contact for us?" And I said, "Sure." When you're earning $90 a week, $15 a week was a big pay jump. So little did I know that within 6 months I would have a semi-office at A&M Records in Los Angeles, because the Hoodoo Gurus had a #1 college radio record in North America, that I'd be having meetings with Herb Albert and Jerry Moss. Herb Albert, the trumpet player, he is the A in A&M Records, and we'd be touring North America. We did, we did 42 shows in 44 days. Anyhow, then I subsequently became Paul Kelly's manager. Paul Kelly was the very first interview I ever did in 1976. We had a bit of a friendship, and then he'd made the infamous, 13 hours on the bus from St Kilda to King's Cross. Called me up, said, do you want to have a beer? I said, sure. And we went to a pub near my office, and 2 hours later I was Paul Kelly's manager. So I worked with Paul. Again, he was signed to A&M Records in Los Angeles. So back we went. We were touring with Crowded House. We were doing all sorts of things. I would go to America 5 or 6 times, a year, every year for many years. And I was still writing and doing all of that sort of stuff. Finished working with Paul Kelly. I started another record label which went for 16 years called Laughing Outlaw Records, which released over 200 records by mainly new and emerging Australian talent. I started broadcasting at FBI Radio in 2003. I was told every show would only last for 6 months, and I'm 22 years later, I'm still there. My Dirt Music syndicated show, which comes out of 2SER, has now been going for 15 years. I'm now starting work on my 18th book, and I've probably forgotten something, John, but that's a potted stuff I do. I did the album program on 2MMM for 8 months with a guy in the 80s. Look, I've interviewed, thousands of rock stars. I've sat in a bar at 2 a.m. in the morning with Bob Dylan. I've waited for Mick Jagger to get a footstool so that he could stand on it to have his photo taken next to me on the balcony of the George V Hotel in Paris because he was terrified, vain enough that he wasn't as tall as me. And he wasn't that much shorter, but anyhow. So yeah, look, it's been it's been a fortunate life. And of course, going back to your intro about I did some publicity work in the early 80s. I worked on the Clash's first tour of Australia. I did the publicity for the Cramps' first tour. I did publicity for Deso Hoffman, who was an acclaimed
photographer,
Beatles photographer. He was an interesting one to do publicity because he didn't actually speak English, but his photos were incredible. But getting him on television and things like that was just a little difficult. And then I didn't do it for a long time. Then about 10 years ago, some friends in Melbourne asked me to help them with the publicity for a book on the 100 greatest Australian singles of the 60s. I did it. I enjoyed it. People started asking me if I'd do it more, so I've become a stupidly in-demand publicist. So my average typical week, John, is 2 radio shows. I've written 8 books in the last decade, working on books and just doing a lot of publicity for mainly Australian artists. I do some Canadians, some Americans, some festivals. And to go back to your podcast, a very, very significant proportion are over 50.
Well, I think that's just very exciting and interesting there for Indie Over 50. And yeah, just to wrap that, an amazing insight into an incredible, what you describe as a fortunate life, but journalist, promoter, label manager in there as well, band manager, and esteemed journalist with author, I should say now, heading towards your 17th book, did you say? 17th?
I did.
Yeah.
17th is out. So
that's the one I've just read, and I've got a couple other ones on my Christmas list. So let's talk about publicity now, because that's an area of sort of unknown, I would imagine, for many indie over 50 artists. It's kind of like 2 groups, if you like, Stuart. There are people who've been involved in music all their lives, maybe gigging or cover bands, or just semi-professionally, and now exploring their own creativity to release music now, post-50, maybe post-retirement. And there's another group that have just come to their music, and they might have been kept in their hands as an amateur, but now, embracing the creative exercise and release. To be able to produce music and release it on YouTube and Spotify, all the other platforms. So the question is, many of them may not have been involved in publicity before. So can you help our listeners understand the role of the publicist and PR as part of that mix of launching an artist?
Yeah, look, a lot of artists, you're right. I mean, some of the people I work with, they started making music in the 70s and 80s. They've kept going. Some took a break, raised kids, got real jobs, and they're back doing it. And some have just gone, I've got some time. I can play a bit of guitar. I can do this, do that. And I've got some songs. I've written songs, and they find their way to me. I don't advertise what I do. Don't have a website. It's always been word of mouth, which I find humbling. That's how everybody comes to me on a recommendation. And yes, they will always say, well, what does a publicist do, mate? And I go, nothing sophisticated, nothing complicated. My job is, because they'll say, I don't know whether I'm any good. I don't know whether if people are going to like my songs, whether they've got any currency. Would anyone play them on the radio? And I go, well, do you want to find out? Because if you're scared of finding out, then I can't be involved. Right? And some of them are, there's an insecurity, and that's completely understandable. But, I say to them, hey, if you want to find out, it's not going to hurt. You have to be psychologically ready, but, no one's probably going to be nasty to you. The worst thing that's going to happen is that they're going to ignore you. And that's okay. I'm used to being ignored, so it'll be the 2 of us together. And so my job becomes getting their music to as many people as I possibly can. And, I mean, I have some artists I work with. One of them, he's not 80 yet, but he's nudging. He's getting very close, I mean, so I do a lot in that 50. I don't think I have anyone in their 80s. I don't think so. But the moment we stop talking, I'll go, oh, shivers, I should have mentioned so and so. But I have a lot in their 60s and some in their 70s. And I say, okay, what we're going to do is a basic publicity campaign, which in my case, I have a mailing list of about 1,300 Australian media people. That's everyone that matters in the ABC, all of the 600 community radio stations in Australia. I don't deal with them all, but there is a free service called AMRAP, which we utilise as well. I do a lot of online stuff for the artists I work with. I don't particularly like Facebook. I prefer Instagram. And even though my daughter works there, I'm never going near TikTok, and I don't advise any artist over the age of about 20 to do that. But I do my work on Facebook because that's where the media live. That's where everyone's looking at who's talking about what records. You can write more. You can put up links easier, all of that kind of stuff. So I do my work on Facebook. I talk to what's left of print media in Australia. That's Rhythms Magazine in Melbourne, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, the Courier Mail, the Adelaide Advertiser, the Australian, the few music magazines that exist. So really, it's putting music in front of people. I only work, in my case, with music that I like, because my reputation is important. When I started to do it as a semi-job, I went, well, there's got to be some payback for 50 years of being in and around these people. And I'm lucky because not only do I know the older people who I've been around for, 4 or 5 decades in some cases, but I know a lot of the younger people because of my work with FBI. And I know, which is a youth radio station with a target audience of 18 to 25. There are 3 token old people they let come in through the doors every week. And so many people now on Triple J are people that have worked at FBI who I've got to know there, and they're now doing programs over there, including the music program and Nick Finlay, and a lot of the daytime on-air presenters. So really, I talk with the artist. We look at the cover art, what images they're going to put with their music, because people are getting inundated with music. So when everything's done digitally these days, there's no demand for CDs or anything. And so when people get an email from me, I say to artists, there's about 4 seconds involved in the person getting that email, making a decision, going, I don't know, I don't think this is for me, or, oh, this looks really interesting, I want to listen to this. So we've got to make the press release information that we send out interesting and gravitating. We've got to make the first image that people see to look captivating. End of the day, the song's got to be good, but it's as good as the artist can make it. And so then I set about putting it in front of, depending on what sort of artist it is, what sort of music. I go, okay, this is ABC Country, this is, ABC Regular, this is Double J, this is, we should send this to Macca, this is Australia all over, or we should get this to regional radio. We work out where songs are going to go. Consistency is the important thing. I say to artists, ideally, a new song every 6 weeks. Keep going. Keep getting your name in front of the media. Keep going, And look, in my case, I send the artists every bit of feedback that I get. And a lot of time, there's not a lot of feedback. And I say that doesn't mean people are not listening. But a lot of people don't put up playlists and they don't tell you. I had one artist a couple of years ago and I felt like I hadn't really done a good job for him. I was, and I liked him. I like all the people I work with, 1 or 2 exceptions. And I rang him up and I said, hey, I just want to say, look, sorry, I feel kind of bad, and that I haven't really delivered much for you. And he said, what are you talking about? And I said, look, I just told you. And he said, Stuart, my friends are telling me they're hearing my song on the radio everywhere all the time. He said, "You've done a fantastic job. I couldn't be happier." And I went, "Well, I wish they'd told me." But we live in a world where most media seem like it's beneath them to partake of such basic information like that we've played your song, Stuart. And, your artist would like to, some people are terrific, but they are the minority. So really, that's what publicity is. Because I have a management background, John, I tend to talk more to my artists than a lot of publicists. If they want what would traditionally fall under management advice, I'll willingly give it. I part of getting where I am is because a lot of really good people have shared information with me. And I'll tell you a story. It was something years ago. I was backstage the first time U2 came to Australia, and I'm not sure why I was there because I don't think the Hoodoo Gurus were playing. But anyhow, I was backstage, and I got talking to Paul McGuinness, their manager. Right, U2 at that stage one of the biggest bands on the planet, and I got talking to Paul McGuinness, and I said, "Hey, I manage this band called the Hoodoo Gurus. We're about to do an American tour." And he said, "Come and sit with me." And so he got U2 on stage, and he sat with me backstage. He said, "Get some paper and a pen." And he spent an hour with me whilst U2 were playing at the Sydney Entertainment Centre. He said, "When you get to LA, you're going to need to talk to this person because they're going to be a potential agent. This is if you want an on-ground American publicist, talk to this person. If you're in New York, you should have a meeting with this person. They're going to, and this is a good radio plugger." And I'm scribbling down all these notes, and this is pre-internet, right? So I'm scribbling down telephone numbers. And at the end, I said, "This is fantastic, Paul. This is unbelievable." But I said, "These people won't know me from a bar of soap." I said, "I'm unlikely to get past the secretary's secretary." He said, "Don't worry." He said, "I will have called every one of these people to tell them to expect your call." And when I got to America a month or so later, and I called these people in LA and San Francisco and New York, they said, "Oh, yeah, we've heard from Paul. Come in." That was a life-changing experience for me. And it's the one that if someone asks me something, I answer the question, because there is too much in this world where knowledge is power. I know this and I'm not going to tell you, and I've railed against that all my life, particularly since that encounter with Paul McGuinness. The other story that night was that Bono came backstage and he'd obviously seen the Sun Herald, and he walked up to me and said, "Stuart, you look so much better in the flesh than in that silly newspaper photograph." But that's an aside. And so with artists, if they come to me, and particularly if they're the older artists, John, and they don't really know how it works in 2025, 26, 27, whatever, I go, "Okay, this is the world that we live in. This is what you need to be able to do. This is where you need, your music needs on the day that we release it. It needs to be, up on iTunes. It needs to be on this streaming service. This needs to happen." And they go, "How do I do that?" And I go, "This is how you do it. How do I get a digital person?" I go, "Well, you talk to this company and you do this." And I guide them through the process, because it's not their fault that they don't know. It's a full-time job for anyone who is lucky enough to do what I do, to keep up. And particularly if they're artists over 50, who've been out of the caper for a long period of time, who some of them stopped making music before CDs came in.
That's it.
It was 1987. It was comparatively late, or a bit earlier than that. And a lot of them, they don't. And it's nothing that they I say to people, there is no such thing as a dumb question. There is, the only thing that there is a question you haven't asked before, and you should ask me. And if I can give you the answer, I'll give you the answer. And if I don't know the answer, then you and I are going to find out together. We will work out who we ask to get that information. And that's what we do, because for a lot of over 50s artists, this whole digital world is completely alien to them. And that's
totally, yeah. Very much they're embracing it, but it is still a new dimension, a new learning, a new everything has changed from our experience when we grew up with if you were privileged enough to go into a studio with the 2-inch and 24 track, or the 4-track at home, or the early, Atari 1040 ST with the MIDI. All that is now just transported itself into a whole new dimension of learning and challenge for indie over 50 artists.
Yeah. So that's what I do, as well as just, the standard, publicity stuff. So, that's what it is. As I said, I only work with music and artists that I like. That's important to me, and as a result, as I get to know artists, some of them I never meet in person, but as I get to know them, I find out what they need to know. And a lot of what people like I do is psychological. You're reassuring artists that, because the song wasn't added to a playlist on the ABC the first week, doesn't mean it's a bad song. I mean, I don't believe there is such a thing as bad music. It's something that's changed in me as the years have gone by. People say, "Oh, that song's terrible." I go, "No, it's not terrible. It's just a song that doesn't resonate with you." And you don't have, I believe, the right to say that anyone else's creativity is terrible or bad. It's just something that doesn't work for you. I listen to a lot of music that a lot of other people I know don't listen to. But if they say to me, "Oh, you listen to all this terrible music," I go, "No, I listen to music that works for me." And so, you're doing that, and you're managing people's expectations, artists, and you're just explaining to them how it works. And sometimes they go, "Well, what's wrong with these people? How come they haven't added my song?" And I go, "You know what? Maybe I might send you over Double J's playlist editions this week. And then you might want to have a look, and then you might want to go onto a streaming service and listen to the music that they are adding and see, are you in that ballpark?" Because a lot of artists come to me, and because I'm at FBI, they go, "How come you're not doing your job? I'm not on FBI." And I go, "No, you're not on FBI. And it doesn't mean I haven't sent your music to FBI, but you almost certainly will not be on FBI ever, which is not your fault, and it's not FBI's fault. But FBI they're not an audience for the music, a radio station with an audience for the music that you do. We need to work out where your audience is, and every so often, something flukes, and you get it on this particular, I'm using FBI as an example. But so you are managing expectations. You're explaining how this world works. Sometimes you're gently saying, "Hey, maybe that cover really is not as, I appreciate that you're using Photoshop for the second or third time, but maybe whilst you keep learning in the background, we might get someone, do you know someone who knows a little bit
Bit
more
of help.
about Photoshop?" All of those things, and, I help if I can with bios and notes. Most artists are better than they think they are at it, but I read everything, and if I've got some input and some suggestions, then it's all of that.
It's a really comprehensive response you provided to help people understand and unlock what publicity is, what PR is, and what is actually provided. For an indie over 50 artist, I guess they've always got, there's probably 3 choices. A, it's ignored, or they just don't know about it. B, they may choose to do it themselves or try, however they do. And thirdly, they may choose to engage a publicist. Have you got any advice for those people who choose to engage a publicist, because they may not all find their way to you, or what
I'm
sort of
easy to
advice or
find.
thoughts do you have
I'm
on that?
easy to find. Look, be careful is my biggest advice. Talk to a bunch of people until you find somebody that you feel an empathy with, who understands what you're trying to achieve as an artist. Be careful you don't get ripped off. There are dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of publicists in this country. I started also doing it because I was incensed at the exploitation of independent artists by publicists in this country. There are 4 or 5 of us who out of all of those publicists who genuinely, I believe, love music. We work really hard. We're friends. And the irony is not lost on us that we're cheaper than any other publicist in the country. So shop around, uh, look. That's why I love that my work comes via word of mouth, because that is another artist saying, "Hey, he did a really good job for me. Contact him." But you can contact me, and then I'll tell you the other good people, and you can have a chat with them too. And then you might go, "You know what, Stuart, you're really fantastic, but this other person's a little closer to what I want." And I go, well, "Good, you're with the right person." So really, it's be wary of people that promise slots, because a publicist can't promise anything except that they can get their music out.
And
And
look, for Indie over 50 artists, we're surrounded by promises. Once you start looking at playlisting searches, services, or meta advertising services, your feeds blow up with all the different platform providers and the promises and the hopes and dreams that are offered. And I'd imagine it would be the same thing with publicity. And as you say, to be able to distill out of the hundreds in Australia and thousands around the world, to distill to the people who are real and have substance and can help artists, I think is a great challenge that you've identified.
yeah, look, there are people, trying to get your money everywhere. My favourite at the moment is the people who are asking, in some cases, multiple thousands of dollars, saying they'll get you on Spotify playlists, right?
Yeah.
Now, that cannot happen. Spotify go out of their way to not communicate with mere mortals like even publicists like me or artists. Because 40 or 60,000 songs a day. Imagine how many phone calls and emails that would be. So the person who says, "Oh, give me $2,000 and I'll get you on playlist," it's a con. This will not happen. I have artists. I have one artist who she averages about 200,000 plays on Spotify every time she releases a song. And I remember when it first started to happen, she rang me up and she said, "Stuart, I just want to thank you so much for all the work you've done on Spotify." And I said, "Well, I could lie to you and go, yeah, no worries, I worked really hard on Spotify, or I could tell you the truth. The truth is I did nothing." And I said, "I thought maybe you had an uncle who worked at Spotify." And she said, "I don't know anyone at Spotify." And she said, "What did we do then?" And I said, "We did a fabulous publicity job, because Spotify get their tips from somewhere." And I said, "I don't know whether it's because they look at 2SER or Triple R, or they look at Facebook, or they look at Instagram. They get their tips from somewhere." And I said, "We did a great job, obviously, because you have come to the attention of these amorphous, anonymous individuals who do Spotify playlists, and also that's great, but also your songs are really good, because no matter, they've got to be good, because otherwise people will stop listening to them." So, and I think the other thing that bugs me, people spend too much time worrying about algorithms. And, when's the best time to put a video out? When's the best time to do that sort of stuff? And you can get bogged down. At the end of the day, what's going to work for any artist is grassroots love for what you do. And people having a conversation going, "Have you heard this song by so-and-so?" And it's an organic growth. And, you can get all maudlin and depressed because, your Spotify figures are not that great. Well, maybe you've got an audience who don't use Spotify. There's all sorts of reasons. But just, worrying about all these stats and stuff, I don't pay any attention to them. I know the majority of, festival promoters don't pay any attention to them. They want to know, can you play live? How good are you live? How good are your songs? All of that sort of stuff. It's word of mouth. I spent $60 3 days ago buying in a record by Don West, who I'd never heard of. Why did I do it? Not because of Spotify, not because I'd ever heard him on the radio. Someone whose taste interests me and I trust came back from a show and said, "Wow, I thought Don West was incredible." I go, Don West. Since then, I've been saying to all my friends, "Hey, do you know about Don West?" And they're going, "No, never heard of him." Or, "Yeah, I know all about him." And so there's other people now going, "Oh, Stuart Coupe's listening to Don West, and I really like Don West." And then someone else is going, "Okay, there's this guy called Don West. There's a bit of a buzz about Don West." And, and Don West's not a kid. He's in his 30s. I mean, he's not in his 50s, but he'll be there soon enough. We all know that. And he'll blink, and he'll be there. So it's that word of mouth's important, and not overhyping it, not buying plays on Spotify, not buying friends on Facebook, not buying friends on Instagram. If you've only got 50 followers on Facebook, that's fun. That's 50 followers maybe you didn't have a year ago.
Mm.
Work on making it 100. Yeah, it's fine.
Very helpful and very practical advice. Thanks, Stuart. One of the things that you've been able to do is just drop some pearls during the course of this conversation. And I am talking about some name-dropping incidents. And I got to say, for all of us fanboys, there's some pretty amazing moments that you've already shared. The Bruce Springsteen moment, the Mick Jagger. Do you want to share a couple of your personal highlights that you're willing to talk about and give us a window into those rare opportunities?
Oh, look, there are many. Some of them are small. Some of them are, I was pretty humbled to get a memoir out published by Penguin, 2 years ago, because it's a bit like a kid growing up in America wanting to be on Motown or Stax. You want that little penguin on a book. Sitting down with Bob Dylan in a bar in Auckland at 2 o'clock in the morning is hard to beat when it comes to encounters. I remember sitting in London in Portobello Road at Virgin Records, its headquarters, with John. Well, he was still, I think he was John Lydon, but he was only just not Johnny Rotten.
Right.
And he had a ring on his finger, and he was playing with it. And I said, what do you want? He said something, and he said, it was my brother's wedding at the weekend, and I was the best man, and I put the ring on my finger, and I couldn't get it off, and I still can't get it off. I remember in Los Angeles with Paul Kelly, and we partied a little hard the night before, and he called me up early afternoon. He said, "Come down to my room now." And I thought, oh dear, what happened last night that I've forgotten about it? And I said, I'll come down in a while. He said, no, come down now. And I went, I'm about to become Paul Kelly's ex-manager, I think. And so I went down to his room and knocked on the door, and he opened it. He didn't even say hello. He just said, sit on the bed. And I went, last night I thought it was fun. And he picked up a guitar and he sang How Many Cabs in New York City, How Many Tears and a Bottle of Gin, and looked out the window, called your name. What do you think? He said. He said, I've just been tinkering with this idea for a song. So, and I often think that is, the first time Paul ever went to New York, I'd been going to New York a lot. His first trip was in 1986, I think. And I remember I was already there, and I remember he always wanted to go to New York. And I said, what do you want to do? We were staying in Midtown. And he said, let's just walk. And we walked like 40 blocks. And every time I hear that How Many Cabs in New York City line, I go, was it that first stomp down to Greenwich Village, as we did walk, I think it was Greenwich Village, that we took together. There's significant things, bringing. Didn't even mention that. I promoted a lot of tours. I brought Lucinda Williams to Australia the first 3 times she came to this country as attempting to be Australia's most successful concert promoter and screwing it up really badly by only touring people I loved. That was great, putting together Roseanne Cash, Mary Chapin Carpenter and Lucinda Williams together for a tour, which Casey Chambers always reminds me her dad took her to when she was 13 or 14. And at that point, she said, I saw that concert and I decided that I wanted to be a country singer. There's those little things that you're fortunate to have been part of.
And what we'll do is we will have the links below to your biography, to your some of those references that we've made to those artists as well, Stuart. And I know in terms of a often I do this as a closing question is, what's your favourite indie over 50 artist?
Yeah, my favorite, like who's over 50 is what you're asking, right? I think it is Bob Dylan's world. We just live in it. And look, right up there for me is Patti Smith, who has been, an uncompromising artist since the 1970s, who's constantly evolved, who's constantly is as powerful now as she was in the 1970s, refuses to compromise, is a voice for change in a pretty hideous world. And so, and I must admit, over the last couple of years, particularly given the world political situation, I've developed a lot more affection for Joan Baez than I maybe had. I listened to her as a kid and in the Woodstock era, but I've gone back and listened to a whole lot of records and went, you have been an unerring voice and a conscience for many generations now. And I still, there's a new protest singer guy called Jesse Wells who's coming to Australia soon. And
Yeah, I went to try and get tickets to that, but I
yeah,
couldn't. It was already sold out, the
yeah,
factory theatre.
they'll probably move the venue to something bigger, I suspect. And so his new single is with a duet with Joan Baez. So that's a full circle
Yeah.
thing for me. So yeah, there's a lot of them. I still listen to a guy called Johnny Dowd who lives in Ithaca, which is upstate New York. And there's a reason I mention that. Johnny Dowd's now made about 17 albums, but he made his first album when he was 50. Up until that point, he was a furniture removalist.
How inspiring. What a terrific note. Stuart, I think what you've shared with us so much is some really amazing insights into the world of publicity, into your background, the opportunities and the adventures you've been able to have, and a pearl of wisdom and inspiration, I think, for all indie over 50 artists with your reference to our friend there, Johnny Dowd. Is that correct?
Yep, Johnny Dowd.
John Dowd.
And he's very, very good. And he keeps on making records. So I'm guessing now he's getting into his 70s, but literally he was 50 when his first album came out.
And in a full circle moment as well, you referred to Jess Wells, who I was introduced through this interview series when asking the question of who is your favourite artist of the 21st century, and their response was Jess Wells. And that's how I discovered Jess probably a few months ago. So with that, I want to offer my thanks to Stuart Coupe, who's been our wonderful guest and on today's Indie Over 50 feature.
My pleasure, John. Good to talk to you. And everyone watching, keep doing it. Don't stop.